Well, welcome. Talk number 2. This is QML for C++ developers, and it's going to be, unfortunately, very fast. We have 20 minutes for this, so I do not have a lot of things that I can talk about here. I could spend a whole training day on this alone. So you're going to get 20 minutes, which means I'm going to have to speak very, very fast. Tomorrow, we will have a small competition where we'll draw a winner of a drone like this. It's a small drone, but you can hack it with C++, which means it's actually quite a lot of fun. So we'll have that at the end of Nazar's talk tomorrow afternoon. What you do is just throw your business cards in this thing down here, and we'll have some of the other Vikings walking around with this one, so you can throw it in, and then tomorrow we'll draw a winner of this little fun. Now, one thing you should know about me and my talks is I write incredibly boring talks and boring slides, so I always have pun jokes at the bottom. There's no reason for it, it's just there. So, moving on. I started Viking software about 3 years ago, but some of you probably have heard about me before. You may even have attended my talks. What we do is just code other companies' applications. If you need that, contact me. There are business cards all over from me. You can find some folders over there. And enough of that. We need some work. So, QML. Now, if I was the one sitting 15 years ago and I wanted to come up with a way to script the signals and slots that Simon had just talked about, then I would write QML, something like that. To me, it's the reason for QML, it's to script signals and slots. Now, when we do this, we call it bindings. But don't be fooled. It's all signals and slots. It's the only thing that we do with this one. So, bindings are from one property to another. And we have a couple of properties at the bottom there. This is your first QML code, the first you've seen. Don't worry, it's not going to hurt you. But so the idea is you have some integers here, and A is 5, and B is A plus 1. Now, if A changes, then this value is propagated to B, so B changes automatically. That is called a binding. So the idea is that whenever you have these signals and slots, instead of using them directly as methods where you emit the signals and you catch things in the slots, you just use them by bindings in your variables. That's basically what QML does. There's a lot more to it, of course, but that's really what I want to talk about in this talk, which means it's really good that it's just after Simon's talk, because now you know a lot about signals and slots. So you can do this. Now, I do have one line there that says, careful about performance, because this, if you're not careful, if you make spaghetti code in QML, and you can do that as well, if you want to, you don't. But if you do, what's going to happen is that these bindings explode. So one seemingly small, I just set the value of A, all over your application, and that's a way to destroy performance, and it's really hard to debug. You almost can't do it. So be a bit careful when you do stuff like that. Other than that, well, unless you do a lot of it, then just use it. It just works. I'll say another thing about binding. One particular bit of thing that I have struggled with is that you don't know how complicated an expression you can have before the bindings stop working magically. And it's different from Qt version to Qt versions. So what I do is to take and break them down into small properties that have really simple expressions like this one up here. And you'll see a couple of more at something later. So let's see some real code. We have a really boring small application where I just test. We have one window, and I have some buttons, and I want to move and some block on the window. That's the only thing we do. And this is, when you want to create this as a C++ programmer, we will make a window with 2 widgets in, 2 buttons, Q push buttons up here. And then we'll make something that draws an item or widget down there, which is the box, and you just move the area. That's what we would do as C++ programmers with widgets. And there's no difference when we do it in QML. So my whole idea with this talk is to let you try and get to the point where you think that QML is actually sort of like programming with widgets and C++, like we know and love, because then it's not so scary. You do actually have to think in a completely different way, but other than that, we are fine. So this button here, that's our component. That's the Q push button we're doing here. There are components that you can use in QML, but they're not complete. And if you're coding for embedded software, which you usually are if you're using QML, then you often end up making your component set completed from scratch anyway. So this button, a button has a signal, clicked, it has positions, it has a way of drawing, stuff like that, but there's not a lot of text that I can do and I don't have time for it, so I'll just stay with this one. We do have the signal. This is exactly the same as if you have a signal when you're coding in a C++ class, a QObject subclass. There's no difference. You use it the same way and you bind to it the same way. Well, sort of. And then we have a property. We do set a few properties here. You would have a long list of properties on a real button, but I only have the background here, which is gray. Then you have a rectangle. This is what's inside. Now we're drawing stuff. A button is usually a rectangle. And inside the rectangle, we saw text. Now, I say inside, but it's actually not. What happens is QML is read from the top down. So what you see is you first draw the outside side by drawing the first inside, then the second, and so on. So the text is just written all over the rectangle. I could have put it inside, no difference. And then at the bottom, a mouse area. So we listen for the click. And if we do get a click inside, then we say button clicked. And that's basically it for the button. Now, there's, of course, a lot of other things to do in this small example that I would have loved to show you about how to set the text from outside and so on, but we can't really do that. One thing I will say about this is the anchoring. Anchoring, you used in C++ and widgets to use layouts. And we do have sort of layouts at the moment, but a lot of the times what you do instead in QML is to use anchors, which means when you have an item, you either anchor it on the side or on the top or on the bottom. Here, I anchor on just fill it out completely. But it's something you'll have to learn to handle as a C++ programmer when you do this instead. If I have time, then I will open Qt Creator at the end and show the full example here and show you how this works. So now in the main, I said we want these two buttons and we want this thing that moves here. That's the idea of this small, brilliant application that I'll sell for $1 million or something. So what I do is this. And I'll just give you a few architecture tips that I tend to use. First of all, whenever I write a file in QML, I always start it with an item. Don't put a rectangle or something in there. That's an implementation detail that you're drawing a rectangle. I start with an item, and then I put the properties that other things are allowed to talk to or set. And then I start the internal stuff downstairs, down below. That's always how I do QML. You don't have to do that. You can do it in any ordering, but it's a way that works, and most of the guys I know follow something like that way of working. The good idea about having an item around is that you can always change the internals, but the properties at the top stay the same, so all the use from around is the same of this object. So here we have the main window. We just have a bool that says, should our rectangle below be on the left or on the right? And we have a button that every time you click it, then it switches over. My example in Qt Creator has two buttons. And then it just moves this one based on which one you click. At the next line under the property is the button. So now we start using the property or the class button that we just made in a different file. And if we click on it, then flip the switch in this one. Below, a rectangle, all of these things, the width 100 and so on, that's setting properties. So that was a bit of QML code. Now, let's talk about the properties, because this is really what QML code is all about. When you do properties from the C++ side, what you do is you create your Q objects, and then you do this Q_property declaration. You've probably seen that before. And the only way this makes sense to you, if you're a C++ programmer normally, is if you use Designer, because then they show up in Designer where you can set the objects visually. But other than that, you don't really use this QProperty thing. But after I started programming QML as well, I've gotten to the point where wherever I have something that is a property, I do put it here, because sometimes it later ends up being injected into QML, and now you have a property. So the A that we saw at one of the first slides could have been a property here that's just an integer. And then when you say to QML, here's an object, it's from QML, it's for QML, and it's a Q object, then please show these properties. And it happens automatically. So if it's a read-only object, then just don't have a write. Or if you do have a write, where you have a set and a get method, then you have to set the notify. So you can also say this A was changed, and then it will do the propagation. That's what happens. I don't know if you already know about dynamic properties in QObject. Dynamic properties are, you can set anything on a QObject. So if you have, take the QApplication object, then you can just call set property foo to something on that. And those properties are just as fine inside QML as well. You see those and have access to those as well. Yeah. So I said, give these Q objects to QML. What you want to do from your C++ side is to keep things in there that have logic. That's usually I had a whole talk about how to split C++ and QObject, C++ and QML code a couple of years ago. But basically what it says of, if you have something that's model code, all your models for your lists or tables or so on, write those in C++. Don't attempt to do that in JavaScript or QML. Keep it in C++ and then expose the objects or the classes to QML and use them from there. So that's what we're doing here. Now we have, for example, a model, and say I have this model that has all my list items, and I do that in the C++ side. Now I want to give that to the QML engine and use this inside QML. So that's pretty much what we do here. It's the set context property. Then you say this is the object name and give the object. And then you can use it exactly like any other inside. So here we have a list view that says my model is this C++ object up here. So you can add more properties to your list model if you want to. You can add functions that you can access and so on. And they're all automatically exposed to the QML side when you do this set context property. Tomorrow in the talk I'll give about the QObject deep dive, I'll go into how does it actually look at all these properties? How does the meta system take up all of the functions, the methods, the properties? Where does it find them? How does it take them from the C++ code that you wrote and inject them into the QML engine? Because what we do on the C++ side is exactly the same as the technology that QML uses to put all of these things available to you. So the last slide I showed was to take an object. I had my object called my list model, and I want this object to be available inside QML. The other way to do it is to take a class and expose that. So you can say, now I want to have any set of my models. I can have 100 list models. Before I only had one. So that's a singleton, basically. Now you're exposing a class, so you can say inside your QML how many of the instances you want to have. So it's two different ways to do sort of the same, and which one you choose is based on the problem, of course. For models, I tend to instantiate those in C++ and give the object name to QML. But for other things, yeah, then it's sort of 50-50. So if you want to do this, you just take any QObject subclass and say QML register type, the class, and then you say the name or the URL that it's supposed to be living in, the version, and what class you want it to be in. So that's what you see down here. The URL, that's what ends up as sort of the namespace. Viking software, this is the version 1.0 and my list model, and then you have your list. So in there, this only works, of course, if your list model can handle having more than one. So don't do this with your database connection, for example, usually. One thing we might want to do from the C++ side is to want to talk to the objects in the QML object tree. And I assume most of you know about the find objects, find children way of doing things. And we can use the same find children because all the QML items are just QObjects. They have a lot of properties and they can do stuff, but they're still just QObjects. So they live in one big QObject tree. So it's pretty easy to just find an object by setting the object name. The ID, for those of you who do know QML, the ID is not the same. The ID is different. So object name and ID, two different things. Totally different things. So QObject, get the root context, and then find a child. Just cast to QObject, because you don't need the details of what kind of object it is. And if it's not 0, then set a property on it, like dynamic properties are set. That's basically it for finding objects. It's surprising how few times you need to do this, but when you do, it's very good to know this small trick. So one of the things that people struggle with when they're moving from QML, from C++ to QML is where should I put my code? Should I write stuff in JavaScript inside the QML code, or should I write C++ code and somehow access that from QML? And what I say to people is, if it's very, very short and simple, okay, you can use JavaScript, but JavaScript is a crap language, so stay away from it. So go to C++. Well, if you don't need, believe me, look at the talk about JavaScript. It's very funny, and I'll give you the link if you ask me. JavaScript is a crap language. But C++ isn't. So whenever you have something that's actually doing real stuff, put it in a C++ class somewhere as a method, then just say at the bottom here, QInvocable, and then you can call it like any other function from QML. So if this was my list model from before, you could add some modify my entries or whatever you want in there. So in the place where you instantiate at the, I jump around like I'm, this one, no, here. So if you had made a QInvocable function on this my list model, then you could call the code here like it was if it was a JavaScript method. And I personally like C++ for many reasons. One, it's a good language and not a crap language. Two, you can also easier unit test. You can unit test QML code, but it's much harder and it doesn't feel as good. It's easier to unit test C++ code, especially if it's just a method. So I tend to do this. So one thing that I show here, which I don't know why I'm on the same slide, but okay. So we have a property Q here, and here I show what happens when you want to be in the slot that says my Q was changed. So that is, no, that's on something change, do stuff, JS. Okay, so that's the reason I'm confused here. So here we have a JavaScript method. So it could have been on Q changed, do stuff, on something else changed, do the C++ stuff. Yeah, whatever. I'm in a hurry. So where to find more? I have gone on over time 1 minute already. So the best way of finding more information on how to do this, in my opinion, is the QML book. I don't know if Johan is here in the audience. No, he's here on the place. He was one of the co-authors of this book, and it's very, very good. And it's the best place to find more information on this topic. Or take one of my business cards, send me an email and ask me about this stuff. So, any quick questions? That's a question.
If I do anything in QML, does that also mean that it's automatically JavaScript? So even if it's just 1 + 1, that's automatically JavaScript?
If I do anything in QML, is that automatically JavaScript? Yes. If it's an expression, then it's JavaScript. If you only write stuff that says property int :a, that's a declaration of a property. But at the below, in slide 2 or 3, there it said property b :a + 1. The b a + 1, that's a JavaScript evaluation of an expression. So yes. Next question.
You said before that if you're using QML, you are probably using for embedded devices. Why is that?
Because QML is very suited for anything where your UI has animations. One of the things widgets does really bad is animations. It's to the point where it's actually so architectured in a way where animations must suck. Sorry. So whenever you have something that moves around, for example, if you create a washing machine today, you obviously need animations or dancing pigs or something like that. Don't do widgets. And also, I tend to see, well, QML is a great language for writing very simple UIs. But it becomes really hard if you have very big and complicated UIs, and you tend to do that on the desktop. The third reason is that the QML, the set of widgets, like same thing that we hear, it's still a toy, unfortunately, because it's not complete. So you don't have a proper set of widgets that you can use on the desktop for QML. So what you do is you have to do your own. So if you're making a desktop game, fine. But I would always be fine with using QML. In fact, I would probably say you should 99% do it. But if you're creating something like an Office application, then you should go for widgets, because then the user expects your widget set to look like any other widget set that you run on your desktop. But on an embedded system, you usually describe the UI completely yourself. So that means you have no reason to look like everyone else. In fact, you probably want it to look exactly like what you think your washing machine dancing pig should look like. So then I can't give you one reason, but I can give you 20 reasons why there is this separation. But basically, it's Office stuff, Q widgets, and stuff with fun UIs, QML. I guess that's it. Thank you very much for listening. I hope one of you win the drone.